The rain had stopped hours ago, but the ground was still soft beneath Jonah's bare feet as he crept across the field toward the old white chapel. His fingers clutched the small folded paper edges smudged with dirt and a faint trace of molasses. He dipped his pencil in syrup after the charcoal had run out. The moonlight shimmered just enough for him to make out the wooden steps leading to the porch. He didn't hesitate. His mother was coughing blood again that morning, and tonight he wasn't praying with his eyes closed anymore. He was putting his hope in ink. Jonah had never been inside the chapel. Slaves weren't allowed, but he'd seen the preacher's shadow pass behind the stained glass every Sunday. He'd watched the white folks sing and bow their heads while the rest of the workers stayed in the fields. They said God was inside that house, God who watched over all, God who made miracles. If that was true, then maybe God could help his mama. He knelt by the steps and slipped the letter beneath the loose plank he had spotted days ago while gathering firewood. He placed it there gently, the way one might place a flower on a grave. The letter had only a few words, his spelling shaky, his sentences simple, but his heart bled through every line. "Dear God," it began, "please save my mama. She coughs blood and she cry when she think I'm not looking. I try make her smile, but she tired all time. I don't got money, but I got faith. Please help. I love her more than sun and moon. Love Jonah." He whispered those last words under his breath as he backed away from the church. His hands trembled not from the cold, but from something deeper, something nameless, that made his chest tighten like a hand pressed against his ribs. He didn't know if God read letters, but he knew writing it felt better than standing still and doing nothing. The walk home was slow. Mud clung to his ankles and the night hummed with the chirp of insects and the low groans of trees shifting in the wind. His mother always said the trees talked to each other at night. Jonah wondered if they talked to God too, if maybe they'd carry his words upward leaf by leaf into the sky. Inside their cabin, the oil lamp had burned low. Miriam lay curled beneath the patched quilt, her breath raspy but steady. Jonah watched her chest rise and fall, thin and fragile like paper fluttering in a breeze. He crawled beside her, quietly, careful not to wake her, but her eyes opened anyway. "You been out?" she asked, voice hoarse. He nodded, pressing a hand to her cheek. "Just for a walk." She smiled weakly. "The star's out tonight." He looked away, afraid she'd see the tears pooling in his eyes. Real bright. She closed her eyes again, murmuring something about God's light watching over them. Jonah lay beside her, but sleep didn't come. He stared at the beams in the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the wood like constellations. In his mind, he pictured the letter still there under the chapel steps. Alone, silent, but maybe not forgotten. He remembered how long he'd spent trying to form the words. He'd written it 3 times before getting it right, or at least as right as he could. His fingers still bore the faint stickiness from the syrup pencil. He'd read over each line slowly, his lips moving in silence the way the white children did when they practiced their readings. He didn't hate them, not Emily, not her tutor, not even the preacher. Emily had once handed him a broken crayon with a grin, and the tutor, Mr. Clayton, sometimes let him stay near the window when he cleaned the chalkboards. That was how he'd learned most letters, watching, listening, hoping no one would tell him to go away. But Mr. Clayton had seen him watching, and he hadn't said a word. One afternoon when Emily had run off to chase a butterfly, Mr. Clayton had knelt beside Jonah and quietly handed him an old reader and a leather-bound notebook. "Use this well," he'd said with a voice that sounded more tired than angry. "Don't let anyone see it." Jonah had. Every night once his mama fell asleep, he'd press his face close to the flickering flame of the lamp and trace the alphabet with one finger, whispering each sound until it stuck in his mind like a prayer. Now lying next to his mother, he pressed his hand over his heart and whispered one more time, "Please God, hear me." And somewhere beyond the cotton fields behind the chapel doors and closed windows, a woman was already sweeping the porch. Her broom caught something small, something soft, a folded paper. She picked it up curious and read. That same morning, while the preacher's wife stared in the stunned silence at the letter in her hands, Jonah was gently spooning broth into his mother's mouth. Miriam was propped up with a bundle of cloth behind her back, her skin pale, her lips dry, her breath still wheezy. She blinked slowly as if each moment took more effort than it should, but she smiled for him. She always smiled for him, even when it hurt. "Did you sleep?" she asked softly. Jonah nodded, lying, like a log. She touched his cheek with a hand that felt like paper. "You always been a good boy," she said, then looked away as another cough rattled up her chest. Jonah placed the wooden bowl aside and helped her sit back. The air inside their cabin was thick, heavy with dampness, wood smoke, and the sharp smell of sickness that never seemed to leave. He hated that smell more than anything. It clung to their clothes, their blankets, their skin. It reminded him that something was dying, slowly, quietly. His mother closed her eyes again, and Jonah sat beside her in silence, his hands clenched in his lap. The morning sun filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting thin beams of light that danced across the dirt floor. Somewhere outside, the rooster crowed, and in the distance, the white folks' house stirred to life. Jonah would have to go soon. He had chores, fetching water, gathering kindling, sweeping the back porch. But for just a minute longer, he wanted to stay. He reached under the cot and pulled out the small leather-bound notebook Mr. Clayton had given him. The edges were worn, the pages dog-eared, but it was still the most precious thing he owned. He traced the first letter on the front page, A, and whispered, "A is for apple." His mother stirred. "You readin' again?" she murmured without opening her eyes. Jonah smiled. "Just practicing." She didn't answer, but he knew she was proud. She'd always told him stories at night, some real, some made up, some passed down from her mother's mother. She believed words had power, even if they weren't spoken loud. "You ever think," he asked quietly, "God reads too?" Miriam didn't move for a long time. Then finally she turned her head toward him and said, "If he made the world, baby, I reckon he can read just fine." He held on to those words like a lifeline. Outside, the day was warming up. Jonah tucked the notebook beneath the loose floorboard and kissed his mother's forehead. "I'll be back before the sun gets high," he whispered. As he stepped out of the cabin, he nearly bumped into one of the overseers. The man scowled but said nothing, just pointed toward the woodpile. Jonah nodded and got to work, eyes down, heart racing. He thought about the letter under the church step. Was it still there? Had someone found it? Did it matter far from the fields inside the parlor of the preacher's modest home? Elizabeth Harding sat at the window with the letter pressed in both hands. Her tea had gone cold. She hadn't moved in 10 minutes. The handwriting was rough, childlike. The words were misspelled, the sentences crooked. But the message cut through her like a blade. She whispered the lines again under her breath. "She coughs blood and she cry when she think I not looking." A knot formed in her throat. She knew the names of most of the slave children in the county, not all of them, but enough to have a guess, and she knew the look of desperation when she saw it. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a hoax. It was a prayer disguised as a letter, a cry that had no place to go. Elizabeth folded the note slowly, pressing the creases with tender care. Then she stood, pulled on her shawl, and stepped outside. The breeze smelled of wet earth and chimney soot. She looked up toward the hills where the big plantation sat white and wide like a smug grin. Her husband had warned her before, "Don't get involved where you don't belong." But something about that boy's handwriting refused to let her go. She would find out who Jonah was. She would find his mother, and she would do it quietly. No noise, no fuss, just kindness and faith. Just enough to answer one child's letter. Elizabeth didn't go straight to the plantation that morning. That would have drawn too much attention, too many questions. Instead, she walked to the market road where the women of the town often gathered to barter eggs, cloth, and bits of news. She stopped by the bakery, greeted the butcher's wife, made sure her presence looked ordinary. But in her mind, she was already sifting through faces, names, and rumors, piecing together any thread that might lead her to a boy named Jonah, who still believed God read letters. By noon, she'd returned home with a basket of apples, a fresh loaf of bread, and a whispered confirmation from the pastor's housekeeper. "There's a boy at the Drayton place. Small, quiet, polite. Lives with his mama near the back quarters. No kin but her." That was enough. She didn't tell her husband. Andrew was a good man but cautious. He preached mercy and justice from the pulpit, but he knew how the town worked, how careful one had to be with sympathy in the wrong direction. There were rules unspoken but ironclad. A woman like her wasn't supposed to care too much or too visibly. But Elizabeth had always been the kind who cried over birds with broken wings and brought home stray cats that scratched her arms raw. She could no more ignore Jonah's letter than she could ignore a fire burning in her own kitchen. Late that afternoon, she wrapped the bread in a clean cloth, added a small jar of plum preserves and a folded towel, and told the maid she was going to pay a visit to the Drayton women with a donation basket. The old man's wife just passed, poor thing. She added, though the excuse felt brittle in her mouth. She'd never met Mrs. Drayton, never had reason to, but her legs didn't falter as she walked the long gravel road toward the white-columned house that loomed like a courthouse at the edge of the trees. At the gates, she smiled politely at the young guard, explained that she'd brought some food for the women tending the sick. He raised an eyebrow but opened the gate without protest. Her presence, her name, still carried enough weight to pass unchallenged. She walked past the manicured gardens and the stables, ignoring the curious glances of the house servants. Her real destination lay far beyond the grand house, past the smokehouses and drying racks, where the dirt path narrowed and the air smelled of coal ash and boiled laundry. The cabins came into view, rows of worn wooden shacks, half sunk into the muddy ground, like memories trying to disappear. She stopped at the third one on the left, the one with a slanted roof and a lopsided chair sitting just outside the door. For a moment she hesitated. It felt like crossing into another world. But then she heard it, a low cough, weak and scraping, followed by a soft boy's voice, humming something tuneless. Her heart squeezed. She knocked gently. The door opened halfway, and there he was. Jonah. He didn't recognize her, of course. Just a stranger, white and dressed too fine for this part of the world. But he looked at her without fear, curious, cautious, and with a flicker of something she couldn't name until she saw the notebook in his hand. The same kind of notebook her husband used to write sermons, worn at the edges, covered in fingerprints. Her breath caught. Afternoon, she said gently, holding up the basket. I was told someone here's been feeling poorly. Thought maybe you could use something warm to eat. He nodded slowly, unsure but polite. Mama's sick. May I come in? He hesitated, then stepped aside. The cabin was small, almost bare. A cot, a chair, a bucket in the corner. But it was clean. And in the cot, barely more than a shape under a quilt, lay a woman with eyes closed and lips parted, as if mid-prayer. Elizabeth moved quietly, setting the basket down, pulling out the loaf, the preserves, and a small cloth-wrapped cake. She didn't ask questions, didn't mention the letter. Not yet. Jonah sat back near the hearth, watching her. She finally looked at him, really looked, and said, I found something this morning. Something I think came from someone very brave. His eyes flickered. I just wanted to say, I read every word. Her voice cracked, but she steadied it. And I heard you. He didn't speak. But in the silence, in the way he gripped the sides of his stool and blinked too fast, she knew he understood. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not charity, but something older and deeper, like the faint echo of a hymn neither of them had ever sung, but somehow both remembered. That night, Elizabeth lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling as her husband's gentle breathing filled the room. The house was still, except for the occasional creak of the wind pushing against the shutters. Her hands were folded over her chest, but her thoughts were far from rest. Jonah's letter hadn't left her mind, not for a moment. His voice was in every shadow, his mother's rasp woven into the hush of the curtains. She'd never felt the weight of words so clearly. By morning, she had made her decision. It was still dark when she slipped from bed and wrapped her shawl tightly over her shoulders. The preacher would be up soon, but not yet. She moved quickly, quietly, like someone carrying a secret too precious to be spoken aloud. By the time the sun breached the low hills, she had already hitched her old cart and begun the ride toward town, the wooden wheels groaning along the rutted road. Her destination wasn't the church or the grocer's. She went to the edge of the town square, where a modest white building stood behind a weeping willow. Its brass plaque read, Dr. Simon Rourke, Physician. She knocked once, then again. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a man still pulling on his vest, his eyes bleary with sleep and mild annoyance. But when he saw her face, the irritation melted into concern. Elizabeth, he asked, is something wrong? She didn't speak at first, just held out the folded letter. He read it standing in the doorway, his jaw tightening with every line. When he finished, he looked up, his voice low. How long has she been sick? Too long, Elizabeth answered. long enough to be forgotten by everyone except the boy who wrote that. Dr. Rourke didn't hesitate. He pulled on his coat, grabbed his satchel, and told her to wait while he saddled his horse. No questions, no sermon, just a shared urgency, quiet and grave. By sundown, they arrived at the edge of the Drayton property. They didn't go through the front gate this time. Elizabeth knew better. She led the doctor around the far side where the woods brushed against the outer fence. There was a place the children used to crawl through to chase fireflies. She had seen it once during a church picnic years ago. The boards were still loose. Jonah was waiting by the cabin when they arrived, as if he had sensed she would return. He didn't say a word, but his eyes widened when he saw the man behind her. Elizabeth gave him a small nod. "This is a friend," she said. "He's here to help." The boy opened the door without a word. Inside, Miriam lay where she had before, but the flush in her cheeks had faded to a color that frightened Elizabeth. Dr. Rourke approached the bed, his face unreadable as he examined her. He asked a few quiet questions, then checked her chest, her breathing, her pulse. Jonah hovered close, watching every movement like a hawk. "She needs rest," the doctor said, finally turning to Elizabeth. "And medicine. I'll leave what I can, but she needs to eat. Real food. No more broth and bread crusts." Elizabeth opened the basket she had brought and handed Jonah a cloth pouch. Inside, there's smoked meat, boiled potatoes, and some dried fruit. Enough for a few days. Dr. Rourke added a bottle of thick brown tonic to the pile. 2 teaspoons. Morning and night. No more. Too much will make her worse. Jonah nodded solemnly, his hands cradling the pouch like it held gold. As they prepared to leave, the boy touched Elizabeth's sleeve. His voice was barely a whisper. "Will you come back?" She looked at him for a long moment, then crouched down to meet his eyes. "I'll come back," she said, "but you must promise me something." He waited. "Keep writing. Whatever happens, you keep writing. Because someone is always listening, Jonah, even if it's not who you think." He nodded, and this time there was no fear in his face, only something stronger, something like belief. Elizabeth and the doctor disappeared into the trees before nightfall, their footsteps silent on the forest floor. No one saw them come. No one saw them go. And in the dark, Jonah sat by the fire, watching the shadows on the wall. He didn't know if God had read his letter or if the woman with the soft voice had simply become the answer. But either way, he felt something new settle in his chest. Hope, thin and trembling but real, stayed with Jonah long after the fire burned low that night. He sat beside his mother's bed, the soft glow of lamplight flickering against the wooden walls, listening to her breathing, which no longer rasped with the same terrifying weight. She was still sick, that much was clear, but the fever had broken. Her sleep was deeper. Her face looked less pinched, less shadowed. Something had shifted. The food, the medicine, the quiet presence of the woman with kind eyes, none of it felt like a miracle exactly. And yet it was more than Jonah had ever dared to expect. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not the other children who shared glances over wash tubs, or the old woman who sometimes brought them scraps of soap. He knew better. Silence was the safest armor. But inside, he carried a swelling warmth that no one could see. 3 days passed. Miriam continued to regain her strength in small, almost invisible ways. She sat up longer, ate more, ate, spoke with less strain. Jonah watched her like a candle he was afraid to touch, afraid to breathe on too hard. He checked the dosage of the tonic, religiously counting every drop with the precision of a scientist. When it was time to give her food, he warmed it, slowly stirred the pot 3 times, just like his mother used to. It felt like following a sacred ritual. But even with this careful rhythm of care and silence, something in Jonah refused to rest. One night, as the wind whistled gently through the cracks in the cabin wall, he reached again beneath the floorboard and pulled out his notebook. The cover was worn soft as cloth, now the corners frayed from handling. He lit a sliver of candle, cupped the flame with his hand, and opened to a clean page. He began to write. "Dear God," the letter started, "thank you for the lady with the quiet voice. I think she, your angel." His spelling was still uneven, the letters tilting like uncertain steps. But the words flowed steadier than before. "She bring doctor, she bring food." Mama laugh again today. Not big laugh, but I heard it. I heard it, and I think maybe that sound reached heaven. He paused, tapping the end of his pencil to his lip, then added, "I don't know if you got time for boys like me." but I hope you read this one too. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening." When he finished, he folded the page carefully, smoothing the creases with both hands. He didn't hide this letter under the chapel steps. Not this time. Instead, early the next morning, he walked to the edge of the woods near the pasture where he'd first seen the preacher's wife arrive. He tucked the letter beneath a flat stone by the path, weighted it down with a sprig of rosemary he'd found growing behind the cookhouse. Then he stepped back, dusted his hands, and returned to the cabin. He didn't expect anyone to find it. But that didn't matter. Writing it had been enough. Sending it out into the world even unseen felt like flinging a small light into the dark. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Elizabeth did come walking that same path a day later, her basket slung over her arm, as she had done once already in secret. And that as she paused to rest by the flat stone, she caught a glimpse of something pale peeking out beneath it. She knelt, lifted the stone, read. By the time she stood again, her hands were shaking, not from fear but from something deeper. A boy who still had so little, who should have been begging for more, had written not to ask but to give thanks. That evening, when she returned home, Elizabeth sat at her desk and took out her best stationery. She wrote a letter of her own, not to Jonah, but to a friend up north, a woman who worked with a group of abolitionists, a woman who had once told her, "If you ever find a case that's worth fighting for, just say the word." Elizabeth wrote about Miriam, about Jonah, about a cabin behind a plantation, about a boy who wrote letters in the dark, and at the bottom of the page she added in careful script, "He has more faith in God than most men I've ever met. If you can help, do." She folded the letter, sealed it, and whispered to herself, "Let this one find its way too." The letter was mailed the next day, tucked inside a larger parcel bound for Philadelphia. Elizabeth handed it to the postmaster with a calm smile, said it was from her husband's ministry correspondence. He didn't ask further. In a town where appearances were currency, her still bought unquestioned passage. She returned home lighter somehow, though no answers had arrived, only the knowledge that she'd done something more than pray. Still, as the days wore on and she continued her quiet visits to Jonah and Miriam, she began to feel a slow creeping pressure around them all, like a storm building in the air that hadn't yet broken. The trouble started with whispers. It began when one of the housemaids at the Drayton estate noticed food going missing from the pantry, a roast chicken one week, a jar of preserves the next. Then there were the rumors about someone sneaking onto the property at dusk. Someone white, a woman. No one named names, but the overseer's eyes narrowed when Elizabeth next passed through the gates with her basket of wrapped goods and medicinal herbs. Jonah sensed it too. He noticed the way the guards near the smokehouse had begun to linger longer in the evenings, their eyes tracking every movement past the cabins. He heard the tightening in their voices, the absence of idle chatter. Something had shifted in the air. One night, as he helped his mother sip from a warm cup of broth, he whispered, "You think they know?" Miriam didn't answer at first. Her face was thinner now, the bones in her cheeks more pronounced, but her eyes had regained their light. She looked at her son, that same look she had given him when he was a baby, learning to walk fierce love hidden behind steel. "Doesn't matter," she said finally. "You can't unring a bell. What's been done's been done." Jonah lowered his gaze, then took her hand in both of his. "I just don't want them to take you away." She squeezed his fingers gently. "They've been trying to take pieces of me my whole life. But they can't touch what's in here," she said, tapping his chest. "Or what's in that book of yours." The next evening, a man Jonah had never seen before came by their cabin. He wore a gray coat and had the kind of voice that didn't match his face-smiling lips but cold eyes. He asked Jonah where they got their food, said it was curious how a sick woman had started looking so well-fed lately. Jonah kept his voice, even said the cook sometimes gave them scraps, which wasn't a lie. The man didn't press, but when he left, he glanced back at the cabin twice. Later that night, Jonah returned to the path in the woods and found the stone where he had once left his second letter. He crouched down and dug a small hole beside it, just big enough for the notebook. He didn't want to bury it, just protect it, just in case. Back at her home, Elizabeth was preparing for her next visit when her husband stepped into the study and shut the door behind him. He looked tired. "Lizzie," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I heard some talk today. About you. About a boy. About visits that aren't being logged in the church records." She turned to face him. "Is it true?" he asked. "What they're saying?" Elizabeth didn't blink. Most of it, probably. He sat heavily in the chair across from her, his face unreadable. You're putting yourself in danger. I know. And if Drayton finds out, he'll bluster, he'll threaten, but he won't want scandal. She looked down at her hands folded in her lap. And if he tries, let him. Some things are worth the risk. Andrew sighed. Then to her surprise, he reached into his coat and handed her a sealed envelope. A reply came. From Philadelphia. Her breath caught. She tore it open with careful fingers. Inside was a single page and a note clipped to it. The handwriting was firm, brisk, but kind. We've reviewed your request. There's enough in the discretionary fund to purchase the freedom of the woman named. We will wire funds to the magistrate's office for proper documentation. Beneath that, a line written in pen, and tell the boy we read his letter. Elizabeth pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes wet with relief. But she knew better than to celebrate yet. Paper could promise many things. The world didn't always follow suit. Still that night, as she packed a satchel with the official forms and quietly drafted a petition for release to the local magistrate, her hands were steady. Somewhere out there, Jonah was still writing. And now the world was writing back. But even then, the ink moved slowly. Elizabeth knew the steps would be delicate, each form requiring a signature, each transfer of funds needing quiet approval, each whisper behind closed doors, one breath away from turning into noise. She navigated it all with the precision of a woman carrying something fragile through a burning house, never too fast, never too loud, always with her head held high and her voice calm. Jonah knew none of this. He only knew that something felt different again. His mother, though still weak, was stronger now, strong enough to hum softly while folding their laundry, strong enough to lean against the doorframe and watch the wind ripple through the cotton fields. There were even moments when her laughter returned light and fleeting as a bird passing overhead. But alongside that hope, a quiet tension hummed in the background. The gray-coated man came back more than once. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he just stood and watched. Jonah noticed the way the other workers avoided their cabin, the way conversations died when he approached. They were being watched now, studied. One afternoon, Jonah returned from fetching water to find his notebook missing from the hollow near the woods. Panic rose in his chest like smoke. He searched the ground, the trees, the edge of the fence, but it was gone. For the first time in weeks, he felt the walls around his world begin to close again. That night, he didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He sat beside his mother's cot, his knees tucked to his chest, his arms around his legs like he was trying to make himself disappear. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived earlier than usual. She came without her basket. Her shawl was pulled tight against her shoulders, and her expression was unreadable. Jonah opened the door before she knocked. He didn't speak, just looked at her with the silent dread of a boy who had already lost too much to ask for more. I know, she said gently. It's gone. But it's not lost. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded packet, then laid it carefully on the table. Inside was a legal document stamped and sealed, bearing the unmistakable weight of freedom. Miriam Holloway Elizabeth, said her voice steady but warm, effective immediately. Released from bondage, registered with the magistrate. Recognized under the protection of the Commonwealth of Georgia. Jonah didn't move at first, didn't blink. He looked from the paper to Elizabeth, then to his mother, who had pushed herself upright, her hand trembling as she reached for the page. She didn't read it. She didn't have to. Her tears said everything. And then Jonah turned away, suddenly overcome his shoulders, shaking with a cry he couldn't control. Elizabeth stepped forward, rested a hand on his back, and whispered, "Your words made this happen. Every one of them." That evening, just before dusk, Elizabeth returned again, this time with a worn leather satchel and a wrapped bundle. She placed them in Jonah's hands. The satchel held his old notebook, its pages slightly bent, but intact, tucked beside a new one, clean, unmarked, waiting. The bundle contained a pair of worn boots, a shirt just his size, and a small envelope with enough coins to buy a train ticket north. "You'll need to decide when," she told Miriam quietly. "But when the time comes, this will get you both where you need to go." The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting a soft amber glow across the yard as Jonah walked to the edge of the field and looked out over the horizon. He opened the new notebook, turned to the first page, and wrote, "Dear God, today I saw my mama smile again. I think maybe you smiled too." He paused, pencil still in hand, and looked back at the cabin, the one that had held so much sorrow, now holding the weight of something else entirely. Miriam stood in the doorway, arms crossed lightly, watching her son with the kind of pride that needed no words. Behind her, the lamp flickered against the wall, casting a warm glow over the place where their story had begun. It was not a loud ending. There were no trumpets, no headlines. Just paper ink and the quiet certainty that someone had listened. And somewhere beyond the hills in a northern office, where abolitionists moved mountains one name at a time, Jonah's letter had been passed around a second time. One man folding the page gently had said, "We'll keep this one. It belongs in the archives." And beside Jonah's careful script, someone had written in firm, clear ink, "Sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truth." If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who still believes in quiet miracles. And if you'd like to hear more stories like Jonah's about hope, courage, and voices that refuse to be silenced, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us. Thank you for listening. Your presence here means more than you know.